when a small band of Cuban revolutionaries from the Fidel Castro movement kidnapped Fangio, and basically they were drawing attention to their cause. It wasn't so much about a ransom.
Well, the author of that book joins us now, Crispian Besley, here in the Freak Nation, checking in from his bunker in England right now. So this looks like your office, Crispian. Is that right?
It is my office. You probably can't see. I'm not sure if the image is good enough, but there are a few thousand. In the shelves behind me, there are a few thousand model cars, which is the genesis of my interest in the sport, I suppose, from when I was a very young kid.
Well, first of all, thank you for joining us. And I've got a feeling this is going to last a little bit. So if we can hold you over for a couple of segments, that'd be great. But the title of the book is Driven to Crime, True Stories of Wrongdoing in Motor Racing. And an overwhelming theme for me here is Formula One. When you get that kind of blow or that kind of cake involved in motorsports, Formula One seems to take the cake. But I want to dive right into NASCAR. And of course, it involves strippers. And we started this thing 22 years ago, and I don't even know this story, but I know the drivers that were involved with this former stripper that raked people across the coals and got millions of dollars, and they spend their ass in jail. Tell me about this stripper that owned this supposed NASCAR team back in, 2021, 22?
It was indeed. She was a lady called Anja Harkness, and she wasn't an American national. She came from the Middle East. She got involved. She was just very aspirational, to put it mildly. She had several failed marriages. She was trying to climb up the greasy social ladder, I suppose, social strata, and she ended up by getting into bed literally with somebody who had similar aspirations to own a NASCAR team. She found funding for it, but it was a very strange deal. They sold somebody a deal and said they'd give them 100% coverage on the car for a tiny amount of money, which they couldn't possibly have run a NASCAR team on, and it all went to pot. The guy who sponsored them ended up by losing all his money, and she got put away for fraud. It's not the best story in the book, but it's NASCAR, that's for sure.
Come on,
wait a minute. Well, I don't want to get too far away from this, but with all the stories you have in the book, Crispian, you can't throw the term out there that went to pot. That's not a
sorry. Good point. There wasn't drugs involved in that so much, but there are plenty of other stories. My publisher wanted to initially sort of segment the book with narcotics, one section on narcotics in both the States and in Europe, one segment on Ponzi, one segment on murders, but that would, I think, become very boring. It's much more interesting looking at the individual characters, and it's across all disciplines of the sport. People lie and cheat and steal, and they kill for a variety of reasons. But when you have and I speak as a competitor myself. I tried being professional back in the late 70s, and clearly I wasn't good enough. But the genesis of the book, it was really goes back that far, because I didn't have any family money. I had to raise the sponsorship myself, and I was reasonably successful at doing so. Arguably more successful than I was on the track at the time. I did share the track with various guys who made it into Formula One. I could have made it. Most drivers will tell you they could have made it higher than they actually did if they'd had the money. But what really interested me was where people got the money from. So you had people, garage owners who would work 24/7 to buy a new set of tires and get themselves on the grid. You had people like me who maybe were better at marketing because I'd been, had a reasonably good education. And then you had very clearly, and then you had the trust fund children as well. But very clearly, the people perhaps who are slightly older than I was at the time, I was a teenager, but it was very apparent that some people were funding their sport or their habit through nefarious means. And that was what, that is the genesis of the book, really. I've always been fascinated in the sport across all levels. I by definition, I'm a Brit, I live in the UK, so I know more about European racing and therefore Formula One than I do about NASCAR and IndyCar. But I love the sport across all disciplines. And over the years, I've just collected stories. I've always been fascinated, not just in the sport, but the commercial side. And as you rightly said, there's a lot of Formula One in it. And in part that is not solely, but in the 90s, there were an awful lot of very strange sponsors and very odd goings on. And it involved a lot of crime. So
again, Freak Nation, Crispian Besley joining us here in the Freak Nation. The book is called, which by the way is out in January via Amazon and other areas or other websites where you buy your books, Driven to Crime, True Stories of Wrongdoing in Motor Racing. Something that we have found of doing 23 years of Speed Freaks, and we probably, again, knew this going into this show, was the return of investment when it comes to investing in a motorsports team, into a car, into an entity. The ROI just doesn't seem to be there. So it's not surprising to me that this, looking at your book, it just seems like it's one big money laundering after another, whether it was supplying money for a stripper or for cocaine over here or some guy's 70-story building. The money laundering just seems to be part and parcel, or again, funneling illegal money into motorsports. It's been going on as long as there's been four wheels on the track.
Well, I think that's true, Kenny. You know, because there's so much, even at the basic level. You know, I race historic cars now. As I got older, the cars have got older, of course. But you know, at every level, it's an incredibly expensive sport, as we all know. And at the higher levels, it presents an ideal platform for money laundering. There's an awful lot of washing of money that's gone through the sport, as you say, from day one, and I suspect to a degree that still happens. I'm not going to cast any aspersions over people who are currently racing, but I'm pretty sure you'll find it's prevalent.
Well, desperation and some kids, I'm going to say, teenage boys and girls who want to be drivers so badly, if they become desperate, yes, it sometimes goes into areas that it shouldn't. So I guess I understand that to a point, but wow, to have so many chapters in this book and knowing there are so many other stories out there, that's got to just dumbfound you as well. You could do an edition too, like tomorrow.
Well, there are quite a few more stories, guys. You're right, which haven't gone into the book, partly because those people haven't yet been convicted. When they are convicted, then I didn't write this because I wanted to defame people. I've been very clear about that. Nor have I tried to glamorize any of the crimes involved. I've had a huge amount of assistance from people who are the subjects of chapters. So some of the criminals, and by no means all of them are mentioned, but an awful lot of people who have done wrong feel if they've served a prison sentence that they paid their dues. Everything I've written is in the public domain. So, and I should also say there are some, in some ways, Driven to Crime is a bit of a misnomer, because not all the subjects of those chapters are actually criminals. Some of them have been on the other side of criminality. I guess someone in Formula One, the last lady to have tried to qualify for a Formula One Grand Prix is a lady called Giovanni Amati, who was a great driver. She didn't make the cut in Formula One, but in 1992 she had some sponsorship, and she was the last lady, and that's what she's best known for, the last lady tried qualifying for a Formula One Grand Prix. The reason she's in the book, however, is because she was the victim of crime, and she was her father was one of the wealthiest men in Italy. This is in the late 70s. He owned a big chain, or the biggest chain of movie houses or cinemas, and at that time, there was an awful lot of politically related kidnappings going on in Italy. She was a very easy target. She was the young, attractive daughter of this incredibly wealthy father, and she was kidnapped. Mm-hmm. And the law courts didn't want to encourage the mafia-related kidnappings, and they froze her father's assets. They refused him the permission to pay out the ransom. He was wealthy enough. The timing coincided with the first screening of the first Star Wars film, and in those days, of course, everybody went to the cinema, paid cash. These days, no one uses cash for anything, but in those days they did. So he raised very quick. Star Wars, as you will know, was a huge success. He raised the required sum of money, enormous amount of money in cash. He was married to Giovanna's mother, obviously, who was a well-known film star at the time, or had been a well-known film star. She had a lot of jewelry. They pawned all the jewelry. They gathered the cash from the box office takings, and they paid off the ransom. Giovanni was released, but there's something called Stockholm syndrome, where people can fall in love with their aggressors. This was actually the other way around. Strangely, she has made it very clear she did not fall in love with her aggressor, but he very clearly had fallen in love with her. And the police were monitoring. They were desperately keen to capture this mafia boss, mafia leader, and they monitored her movements. They knew he was in touch with her rather than the other way around. He was sending her flowers, and they persuaded her through her parents that she had to cooperate with them, and they basically arranged a sting whereby she met him for a coffee in a Roman a palazzo in Rome, and they jumped on him and they captured him. So that's the reason behind the story. And the story goes on. He escaped prison twice, and then was caught in the last 10 years or so. By this time in his 70s, and a grandfather of 5 children, he was caught on a train by an eagle-eyed ticket inspector on a train in Switzerland. Yeah. But that's the story there. So make it very clear. Giovanna is not in the book because she's a criminal. She's absolutely not. She's still races and does driver tuition, is a great lady. But most people know her for her racing exploits, not for the fact that she was kidnapped as a teenager before she'd even started racing.
I think she would like to keep it that way too.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, it's a story in the public domain. She's She's been interviewed many times about it, but right. Her reputation, quite rightly, is as an extremely good racing driver.
No, yes, and that's what I meant by that. She would prefer that the racing be top priority for people, but hey, that is her past, and she does have to acknowledge that. You brought up earlier in this interview, of course, we're talking about the book Driven to Crime with Crispian Besley, and you brought up earlier that many of the people that have been convicted have apologized, or they've gone back on saying that they want to be forgiven. I forget the actual phrase that you used, but Jos Verstappen is one that came to mind, and I'm having a hard time with him and now his son being so popular in Formula One, of course, Max Verstappen, 2-time champion, because Jos was just a bad guy. And I feel like his lawyers constantly got him off. So when Max Verstappen first came on the scene as a driver in Formula One, I just had a very hard time wanting to like him because of how bad his father was. Am I in that wrong? Is that kind of common, do you find? It's tough when somebody has a bad history that all of a sudden we're supposed to accept him as he's forgiven and we're ready to move on to the next chapter.
As I said earlier, it's not my job, or I didn't feel it was my brief to be judgmental about anybody. But I mean, Jos Verstappen was a talented Formula One driver in his own right. Let's not forget that. He had probably an overdose of aggression, which a lot of racing drivers have to varying degrees. But his son, Max, is, by all accounts, I've not met him, but is a lovely, lovely guy. Whilst you can see he, in his, as he's now a twice world champion, you can see he's incredibly aggressive off the track. He has maybe a little bit of a reputation for being a spoiled child, but he's worked really hard at it, and I think by all accounts he's a very nice man, very nice young man. And I say, without being judgmental, I think he's got most of his social graces from his mother, who was an extremely also very talented racing driver. She was very, very talented in the world of karting, which is how I think she met her husband, her now ex-husband. But Jos is an aggressive guy, and is in the UK we call them karting fathers. And I've been a karting father. Both my boys have raced, and you meet an interesting sort of person sometimes. And Jos is one of those. He's crossed the line. He's got away with it. He's got. He's had outstanding convictions, but he's never been to prison, really. So, but overly aggressive, perhaps. But.
Crispian Besley. I will ignore the fact that you said wonderful things about Max Verstappen. I'll let that sit on the sidelines and move along. Author of Driven to Crime: True Stories of Wrongdoing in Motor Racing. There is a name here in the United States, Scott Tucker, who I don't know. I haven't seen the book, but I'm told that name is not in the book. He was, I think he's serving in Leavenworth right now, federal prison here in America, and for loan sharking and racketeering, payday loans and usury up to 35%. People couldn't pay the loans back because of the interest that was charged. Was that a decision to leave that out, or did you not know about that because he was a sports car driver at a team called Level 5, raced Ferraris and other sports cars here in the United States?
Well, Stat, you're quite right. You just proven to me that you haven't read the book yet, and I think that's because there's been a problem with availability out there. But you're wrong. Scott Tucker is chapter 57.
Oh,
there you go. There you go.
Great.
So,
I was.
Yes, I do know about him. I think the latest. There was a great. I think my chapter is better, actually, but there was a very good Netflix program, which I imagine you guys have seen, released a year or so ago. And it's a fascinating story. And I would thoroughly recommend watching the Netflix article and then read my chapter on them as well. They're complementary to one another. But he was definitely a bad guy. He was, actually quite a successful driver, as I think you said, with his Level 5 team. But he was an interesting character because on the one hand he claimed to be very reclusive. On the other hand, he spent vast amounts of money and flaunted extreme wealth. So. Interesting guy. He had one of the biggest paddock arenas, I gather. So very private on the one hand. He wanted to flaunt his wealth on the one hand, but wouldn't let journalists anywhere near him on the other. It's a very strange animal. But you're right, he is in prison. I think he's appealed very recently. And I think he made that sentence. Don't quote me on this, but I gather that sentence may be reduced. But he got a very stiff sentence for it. He was not one of the people I was able to contact. I would love to have talked to him, and I suspect that he would. Well, I think he is still proclaiming his innocence. But there are other people who have been maybe more honest about things. And as I say, I've spoken to many of them, and it's fascinating. It's a fascinating, at the end of the day, these people are all human beings, and they're flesh and blood. Not everybody goes down the right route. And some people I've spoken to, as you alluded earlier on, say, yeah, I did wrong, but I'm now a reformed character.
It's more than just a slogan. General Tire delivers for whatever you do. General Tire's Grabber X3 mud terrain tire offers aggressive styling and is engineered for durability with innovative performance features that are ready to carry you through extreme mud, dirt, and rock-covered terrain. For extreme traction that's ready for anything and rugged styling to match, look no further than the Grabber X3. General Tire delivers for whatever you do. Check out GeneralTire.com today. General Tire, aggressively styling the speed freaks since 2001.
Hey, Dad, what are you going to buy at the store today?
I'm out of Lucas Oil fuel treatment, so let's jump in here and grab us some.
Well, do they have the Lucas Oil parts cleaner and degreaser?
I bet they do.
Well, how about the Lucas Oil power steering fluid?
They'll have that too.
Even the octane booster?
I won't be surprised if they do.
My favorite red and tacky grease?
Yes, they will, babe.
Dad, when we're done, can we grab some candy?
Deal, but you gotta share.
Awesome! Lucas works.
There was a time you mentioned you were involved in racing. I was many years ago, back before the mud hardened, I was involved in racing a little bit. And we had a common phrase that when people showed up at the racetrack with no visible means of support and all the cars and people and haulers, they were looked at kind of side eye with where'd this money come from? And they would just as soon disappear. And, maybe a year later, they were in the headlines. Have you found that to be the case with some of they just showed up and were spending money like crazy, and they, more times than not, they were involved in something illegal?
I wouldn't say at my level. So I was racing Formula Ford in sort of 70. What was it? 78, 79. So I don't think I was aware of it then. I'm more aware of it, I think, now, racing historics. There are people who come and go, and there's a well-known historic racer who hasn't yet been convicted for VAT fraud, but will be, who I know personally. So he and obviously I can't mention his name,
right?
But you will have to wait for the second edition of the book for that. But it only when it's in the public domain, and only when he's convicted will I be able to write anything on that. But I think if you look at the history, I think if you look at the history of motor racing, and again particularly going back to Formula One, there are people who have literally appeared and overnight and then gone overnight, but they're less on the driving front. Actually, they're more people who again are either dreamers or are washing money, and they tend to be people in team ownership positions or even sponsors. Hence
Angela, the team owner position. I get her name confused.
So with Angela Hartless, she's one example of the stripper who came and went and disappeared without a trace. But there are more interesting. There's an industrialist. There used to be a very big dairy company Italian based, but it was a global brand called Parmalat, and Parmalat were one of the biggest dairy producers in Italy and indeed the world, and they came to prominence in motor racing by becoming, first of all, a personal sponsor of Niki Lauda, who was, for those of you on your side don't follow Formula One, was 3 times world champion, and died a couple of years ago. Best known for his very fiery crash in 1976 at the Nürburgring, which nearly killed him. But he had a personal sponsor called Parmalat, and Parmalat then went on to sponsor Bernie Ecclestone's Brabham team in Formula One, and Niki Lauda drove for them. And it was owned by a guy called Callisto Tanzi, who partly built the brand through his sponsorship, not just of motor racing, but one of the big Premier League football teams in Italy. And that was in part what built the company into an extremely successful brand. It was, he became a billionaire, but a lot of that was legitimate. An awful lot of it was incredibly illegal. There was moving around of money off balance sheet, on balance sheet, and he ultimately went under. He actually died not that long ago under house arrest. But he had been given all the accolades of one of the most successful industrialists in Italy. Heavily involved in Formula One, even after Lauda retired. And he was just somebody whose ego was enormous. But there are many other people, again, in Formula One who there was a prince. Again, you'll have to read the book, people, but a prince who convinced Tom Walkinshaw, who was an entrant and then owner of the Arrows Formula One team, and the team, as Formula One teams have been historically, they go through, the sport at the moment is going through an incredible high, thanks to actually Netflix and Drive to Survive, which is all your American friends and my American friends and colleagues are massively interested in Formula One at the moment. But for a long time, teams have been some of the fly-by-night teams, but some of them have been in dire financial straits. And when this guy appeared from nowhere and said, "I'll give you $125 million," Tom Walkinshaw was desperate. And he said yes. And this guy put his name on the car, or his company name. The company didn't really exist. There was no product. And he put his name on the car, and he promised the earth. And long story short, he did disappear. He's still around, but he disappeared.
Wow.
Not to be found?
Well, he was found subsequently, yeah.
Okay. I'm like, wait a minute.
and he's still very much around. He basically defrauded Walkinshaw, and he went on to defraud other people, actually on your side of the pond as well. But he's an interesting guy.
Freak Nation, his name is Crispian Besley, joining us here in the Freak Nation. The new book, it's fantastic, Driven to Crime, True Stories of Wrongdoing in Motor Racing. Can you stick around for another segment, Crispian?
Of course I can, yeah. Be pleasure to.
I want to get to the bottom of this. Regarded by many people, I don't know if they're still alive, as the greatest Formula One driver ever that was taken hostage. I want to get to that story. Mm-hmm. And if he has any dirt on one of the biggest asses in Formula One history, Ralf Schumacher. You know how I feel about Ralf Schumacher.
Are you mad that Ralph is not in the book, Kenny?
He may be. Regardless, Crispian Besley probably would like to be the hell off this interview. Crispian Besley joining us, Driven to Crime, True Stories of Wrongdoing in Motor Racing. The book comes out at the end of January. He joins us here in the Freak Nation. Let's just get this over with. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it. Have you found any dirt on former a-hole that ran in Formula One, Ralf Schumacher, the brother the uncle of Mick Schumacher? Have you found any dirt on old Ralphie?
I'm afraid I haven't, Kenny. No, I'm sorry to disappoint you. There's no dirt I know, other than the fact that he's probably one of the biggest supporters of his nephew Mick. And Mick is not a bad driver, even though your US friends have let him go for this.
Hold on, just a second.
No. We're not all claiming friends there. Listen. No, you're all good.
Didn't Ralf Schumacher? And I can say this because it's not. Listen, the FCC doesn't give a damn if I say this. He owned at one time, I think, like a sex toy shop. If that doesn't scream money laundering, freaking Besley. Stop. He's laundering money, allegedly. I'm not accusing him of that. In fact, you can email me at SpeedFreaks. Sorry, I've learned something new because I was not aware of that. So
hold on though.
I'm disappointed I wasn't aware of it.
Here's the deal, though, because yes, we had a run-in with Ralf Schumacher many moons ago, and so this show is not really. We don't really like him. However, I really like hearing that he's a big supporter of Mick's career. So, I mean, Ralph.
Oh, it's going to go down in flames now, man.
No, it's not.
Ralph is freaking snake bit.
No, it's not. No, it's not. I like that because I want the best for Mick Schumacher. I think a lot of people really do. And like you alluded to earlier, he is a talented driver. He just needs to be given the right chance.
Okay, listen, enough on Ralph and the freaking Schumachers.
Can he answer that question?
No,
about
because
Mick?
I want to get to Juan Manuel Fangio, who a lot of people regard as the greatest Formula One driver in the history of mankind, 5 F1 championships. And this dude was captured and held for ransom at one time?
Yeah, he was. It was in February, I think 1958. There was a non-championship race held, I think, for 2 or 3 years consecutively. And it was all to do with Fidel Castro. It was a very strange event. It occurred away from the track when a small band of Cuban revolutionaries from the Fidel Castro movement kidnapped Fangio, and basically they were drawing attention to their cause. It wasn't so much about a ransom. These guys made friends. Once he understood he wasn't going to be harmed, he didn't know that to begin with. It was all very scary. He was kidnapped. He was at a reception promoting the race, and these bandits turned up with a lot of guns and moved him initially to one house and then to another house. And it's a great story. And the guy he missed the race. The race actually was stopped early because a driver crashed and killed some marshals and spectators, but which was very sad. But in the meantime, Fangio, watched the race with the bandits on television, and then was released soon after. But they succeeded in drawing attention to their cause, and that was what it was about. It wasn't so much about money and ransom.
Wow. Okay, now can he please answer Mick Schumacher? Come on, Mick Schumacher's a good dude, right? He's a good
I think Mick Schumacher is a very good dude. I mean, it's probably not subject for this program, but he's struggled. He has a very good record in the lower formulae. First of all, he's done his apprenticeship. As you guys will know, testing these days in Formula One is very limited because of budgetary constraints. So the best way of learning how to race the Formula One, how to drive a Formula One car, is to race it. And he's had 2 years, of which the first was, the first 2 have been obviously with Gene Haas's team. But the first was in a not very competitive car. He was then up against last year in 2022 against a very talented, much more experienced driver in the form of Kevin Magnussen, and he's now been scooped up by Mercedes. If in the unlikely event, but if Lewis or George Russell were taken sick or injured, then I think you'd find they'd put him straight into the car straight away. And I think he'd be very, very good.
Opportunity is what matters sometimes. I mean, you could just be in subpar equipment, all of a sudden, boom, you get the right deal, and then your career is magic. Yeah. Real quick, before we let you go, bring it back to the States. Elmer George, I'm an Indianapolis born and bred person, and this whole story, I don't think I knew that he had marital issues with Mary. I knew that he was a bit of I don't know what the term is I want to use. I mean, he was using sort of the family money to fund his own racing career.
Ralph Schumacher light?
No. But I don't think I realized the extent of how he actually died until your book. Wow.
Yeah. Well, it was very sad. He was, he married in, as you will know, he married into racing royalty, the Holman family, and he was reasonably talented in IndyCar. He wasn't top draw. Once he retired, he got involved in the management of the Speedway, and I think that was a big fall from grace. He was as you alluded, he was a hothead, and not very popular within the family. I think Mary's father felt that he had married for money rather than for love. Mary certainly fell out of love with him, and whether he was it was a fiance or just a boyfriend, they were going to get divorced anyway. But I think he didn't accept it. He followed his aggressor to a house which is on the estate, which he was partly responsible for managing, told him to leave straight away. A fight ensued. Gunshots were exchanged and he died. And it was, probably an accident waiting to happen, but it was sad, but yeah.
And that was hours after the Indy 500.
It was, yeah. Well, I think he actually followed. He left the circuit during the 500, actually. So I'm not sure of the timing of the murder, but the killing.
Yeah.
Crispian Besley, has written the book, incredible book, Driven to Crime: True Stories of Wrongdoing in Motor Racing. What is it about motor racing that attracts this kind of personality?
Money.
Just the desire for money and
I think that's what attracts the crime, actually. But what is about the sport? As we all know, whether you compete or whether you just spectate, it's full of very big egos and very, very competitive people, and that can bring out the best in some people, and it can bring out the worst in some people.
Could you do this exact book for worldwide soccer, football?
That's a really good question, and the answer is I couldn't, because my sport, my discipline is motor racing. But a lot of people have asked me that, and I there are an awful lot of sports, and I cover this in the introduction. But there are an awful lot of sports, equestrianism for sure, football, on your side of the pond. Basketball, huge money sports for sure. Boxing over here. Unfortunately, where there's sport, there's money. Sport. A lot of sport this day is about business, and the answer is yes. And I've talked to friends of mine who are commentators in other disciplines. There is corruption in every sport. Whether there's more in motor racing than there is in equestrianism, I don't know. But where there's gambling, there's crime. Where there's gambling, there's money. Where there's money, there's crime.
Hey, Crispian, let me guess. Crystal City or Tottenham Hotspur?
I'm actually not a football fan, but I like most sports. But if I was, I think the answer would probably be Chelsea.
Yeah.
So neither of those two, Kenny, but Chelsea's going through some financial difficulties, but partly because of the ownership by a certain Russian gentleman.
Yep. Well, I'm sure Ralph Schumacher standing in line with some of his sex toy money that he laundered for many, many years.
Allegedly.
Stat MC at SpeedFreaks.
Stop it.
Oh,
I love that.
Oh, boy.
Kenny won't let him live it down.
I will not.
Ever.
It's going to be on my epitaph. Hey, Crispian, thanks for doing this, buddy. This is fun. I hope we didn't give away too much of the book. These stories are incredible. I think you should be honored for the research that you had to do to grab all of these gnarly stories in motorsports.
Completely, yeah. And the familiarity with the story off the top of your head. Yeah. You've been talking here for more than a half hour. Just we're throwing stuff at you, and you're just giving it back to us. I respect that a lot.
Oh, thank you.
Your most prized knick-knack behind you. What's of all the cars that you've collected? You can get up off your damn seat and show us the most prized model car. What am I trying to say here? What am I trying to say?
The diecast.
Diecast behind you is what?
Oh gosh.
Show me something.
They're actually the other ones are in another room. But I collect real cars as well. So I rather than getting up and showing you one, I guess one would be my favorite road car that I own is a Dino Ferrari, and which is a 246 Dino Ferrari, and I guess my favorite racing car would be my little Cooper T56, which is a Cooper Formula Junior based on a Grand Prix car. And I've had quite a lot of success with that. So,
well, how much money did Dino Ferrari embezzle back in the day? I'm just joking, okay?
There are good people in all sports too, Kenny.
There are. Absolutely.
Well, 3 or 4 of them have been thrown in jail since we started SpeedFreaks.
Well, I said those aren't the good ones.
Oh, buddy. Crispian, thank you very much for doing this, man. And again, Freak Nation, it's called Driven to Crime, True Stories. That's true stories of wrongdoing in motor racing. And it's Crispian Besley here in the Freak Nation.
Get it on Amazon. You are going to be wowed just by reading the first 5 words. It's incredible.
Thank you very much, everybody. Really good to meet you.
Thank you, buddy.
My pleasure.